His voice was calm, almost careless, like he was commenting on something trivial. "If you're going to sit there like this, maybe you should just leave." For a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded. The clinking glasses, the laughter from his friends, the low music playing somewhere behind me, all of it blurred into a dull ringing in my ears. I looked at him, really looked at him, hoping to see hesitation, regret, even a flicker of concern. I saw none, so I nodded. I stood up without saying a word. I pulled my chair back carefully, not wanting to make a scene, not wanting to give anyone the satisfaction of drama. I grabbed my purse and walked away from the table where I had spent the last 2 hours feeling invisible. What he didn't know was that 5 minutes later, the waiter would return holding my credit card receipt. What he didn't know was that I had paid for the entire table. Every appetizer, every drink, every dessert they hadn't even ordered yet. And what he definitely didn't know was that this was the last thing I would ever do for him as his girlfriend. My name is Emily. I'm 29 years old, and until that night, I thought I was in a solid, loving relationship with my boyfriend of 3 years. His name is Mark. 3 years of building something I believed was real. 3 years of adjusting myself to fit into his world. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party. Instant chemistry. Easy conversation. Within 6 months, we were talking about moving in together, about careers, about the future. He worked as an accountant. I never cared that his job wasn't flashy. I cared that he made me feel safe. Or at least he used to. For most of those 3 years, I believed we were growing together. Quietly, steadily. I thought love didn't have to be loud to be strong. But 4 months before that dinner, something shifted, slowly, subtly, and painfully. By the time I stood up from that table, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, I finally understood the truth I had been avoiding. I hadn't suddenly become quiet that night. I had been shrinking for a long time. And walking out of that restaurant wasn't a dramatic exit. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. Because staying would have meant accepting that this was how I was going to be treated from now on. And I finally understood something important. I deserved better than silence at my own table. Before everything fell apart, I would have told you my life felt stable. Not exciting in a cinematic way, but grounded, predictable, safe. I was 29, working full-time, paying my bills on time, and building what I thought was a mature, adult relationship with a man I trusted. Mark and I had been together for 3 years, long enough to stop questioning whether we were serious, long enough to assume we were moving in the same direction. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, one of those crowded gatherings where you don't expect anything meaningful to happen. I remember noticing him because he wasn't trying to be the loudest person in the room. He listened, asked questions. When he laughed, it felt genuine, not performative. By the end of the night, we were standing on the balcony talking like we'd known each other for years. I gave him my number without hesitation. The early months were easy, effortless. We texted constantly, went on long walks after dinner, stayed up too late talking about work, family, and where we thought our lives were headed. He worked as an accountant, detail-oriented, structured, responsible. I liked that about him. I liked that he wasn't flashy. I liked that he felt steady. Within 6 months, we were talking about moving in together, about timing leases and neighborhoods, about what it would look like to build something real. For a long time, he made me feel chosen. I won't pretend everything was perfect. It wasn't. But the flaws felt manageable, normal. He could be passive in social situations, uncomfortable in large groups. I tended to take on the role of smoothing things over, making conversations flow, making sure everyone felt comfortable. At the time, it felt like balance. I didn't realize how often that balance required me to shrink. About 4 months before that dinner, Mark joined a new social circle through work. A tight-knit group of about 6 people who went to trendy restaurants, documented everything on Instagram, and spoke in inside jokes that made you feel like an outsider if you missed a single reference. At first, I was genuinely happy for him. He'd complained before about feeling disconnected in the city, about not having his people. I wanted him to have that. But slowly things changed. Invitations stopped including me automatically. When I did come along, I felt like an accessory instead of a partner. Conversations flowed around me, not with me. Mark laughed louder with them than he ever did with me at home. He seemed sharper, more confident, more alive in their presence. And without saying it directly, he started treating me like I didn't quite fit anymore. There were small moments I brushed off. Jokes about my job being simple, corrections when I misspoke, Always in public, always framed as teasing. The way he started saying we when talking about his friends' plans, and I when talking about ours. None of it was dramatic enough to confront, but all of it left a residue I couldn't shake. His friends mattered to him. I could feel it. Their approval mattered. Their laughter mattered. And somewhere along the way, mine stopped. I told myself I was being sensitive, that this was just a phase, that relationships evolve. I didn't want to be the girlfriend who complained. I didn't want to threaten the stability I believed we had built. So I stayed quiet. I adjusted. I smiled when I felt uncomfortable and told myself love required flexibility. Looking back now, that silence wasn't maturity. It was self-erasure. And the night of that dinner wasn't the beginning of the end. It was simply the first time I stopped pretending everything was fine. The more time passed, the more I realized the problem wasn't just his new friends. It was the version of himself he became around them, and the version of me he seemed increasingly comfortable diminishing. It started with subtle exclusions. Group dinners I found out about afterward. Weekend plans mentioned casually, as if I were supposed to assume I wasn't invited. When I asked, he'd say things like, "It's mostly work people," or "You wouldn't really enjoy it anyway." He said it gently, but the message landed all the same. You don't belong there. When I did join, I felt like I was constantly misstepping. Conversations moved fast, layered with references I didn't understand. They talked over one another, laughed loudly, posted stories mid-sentence. Mark thrived in that environment. He leaned forward when he spoke, interrupted without apologizing, cracked jokes that landed immediately. I watched him become someone sharper, louder, more performative, and I watched myself fade into the background. Once, at a dinner party, I tried to tell a story about something funny that happened at work. Halfway through, he corrected a detail I hadn't even gotten to yet. "That's not how it happened," he said, laughing like it was harmless. Everyone laughed with him. I smiled, nodded, and let the story die. On the drive home, he didn't notice my silence. Another time, one of his friends asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, Mark jumped in. "She's in a pretty straightforward role," he said. "Nothing crazy." I felt my face burn. It wasn't untrue, but it was dismissive. And it hurt more because it came from him. I started noticing how often I edited myself around him, how I chose my words carefully, how I paused before speaking, gauging whether it was worth the effort. I told myself this was just me being considerate, but deep down, I knew I was avoiding the risk of being brushed aside again. His friends weren't cruel outright. They were indifferent. And Mark never filled the gap, never redirected the conversation, never defended me. Sometimes he was the one leading the dismissal. A raised eyebrow, a joke at my expense, a hand held up mid-sentence to quiet me. I told myself relationships go through awkward phases, that maybe I was projecting my insecurities onto him, that I needed to be more confident, more relaxed, more fun. So I tried. I dressed differently. I laughed louder. I talked less about my own life and more about his. None of it brought me back into the circle. The night of the engagement dinner was supposed to be a turning point. He told me it was important, that I should dress nicely, that his friends would be paying attention. I took that seriously. I wanted to show up as his partner, not an afterthought. I didn't know then that I was walking into the moment where everything I'd been swallowing would finally come back up. By the time we sat down at that long table, with wine glasses already half full and conversations overlapping, I could feel the tension in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was just nerves, that if I stayed calm, stayed kind, stayed quiet, everything would be fine. I didn't realize how close I was to my breaking point, or how one sentence would push me past it. The dinner was supposed to be a celebration. That's what I kept reminding myself as we walked into the restaurant. Upscale Italian place downtown. Low lighting, white tablecloths, the kind of restaurant where the menus are heavy and the wine list feels intimidating. Mark had told me to dress nicely, that it mattered, that this night was important. So I did. I wore a dress I knew fit well, heels that pinched just enough to remind me I was trying. I even brought a bottle of expensive wine, something thoughtful, something generous. I wanted to show up as his partner, not as someone tagging along. From the moment we sat down, I knew I was in trouble. Mark slid into a seat between two of his friends, Amanda and Bry, without hesitation. I ended up at the far end of the table next to a man I'd never met who barely looked up from his phone. The seating felt accidental, but it wasn't. It was a pattern I recognized instantly. I had been placed where I wouldn't interrupt. I tried to engage, I really did. I asked questions. I smiled. I laughed when something was funny. But every time I started to speak, the conversation moved right over me. Stories overlapped. Inside jokes landed without explanation. My words floated out and disappeared. I felt myself retreating inward, that familiar tightening in my chest. About an hour in, Mark started telling a story about a disastrous client meeting. I'd heard it before. I knew the context. When I tried to add a small detail, barely a sentence, he held up his hand without even looking at me. "Babe, I'm telling the story," he said. The table giggled. Not awkward laughter. Real amusement. I stopped mid-word, my mouth closing slowly. I nodded, picked up my fork, and focused on my plate. My appetite was gone. I watched him perform after that. The way he leaned in, the way everyone listened. The version of him that existed only when I wasn't included. It felt like watching someone I knew very well pretend I wasn't there. Then Amanda passed her engagement ring around the table. Everyone admired it, offering compliments, squealing, asking questions. When it reached me, I smiled and said lightly, "It's beautiful. Must have cost more than my car." I meant it as a joke, self-deprecating, harmless. The silence was immediate. Then Bree smirked. "Well, some of us have higher standards than others." The table exploded with laughter, loud, unrestrained. Mark laughed too. He covered his mouth like he was trying to be polite, but he didn't stop it. He didn't correct her. He didn't say my name. I looked at him, waiting for something, anything. He shrugged and leaned toward me. "Don't be so sensitive," he whispered. That was it. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't storm out. I sat there for another 20 minutes in complete silence, not to punish anyone, but because there was nothing left to say. My body felt tight, like it was bracing for impact. All I could think about were the past few months, the comments about my job, the way he corrected me in public, the way he said "we" when talking about his friends and I when talking about our plans. This wasn't new, this was just louder. Finally, Mark leaned over, his voice low but sharp enough that I heard every word clearly. "If you're going to be this quiet, maybe you should just leave." I turned and looked at him, not angrily, not desperately. I looked at him like someone who was finally seeing the full picture. He didn't look back apologetically. He looked annoyed, embarrassed by me. So I nodded. I stood up slowly, pulled my chair back carefully, picked up my purse. I didn't announce anything. I didn't say goodbye. I walked straight to the front of the restaurant where the waiter was standing. "I need a favor," I said quietly. "I'm paying for the entire table, everything. Drinks, food, dessert. But I need you to wait exactly 5 minutes after I leave before you tell them." He looked confused, but he nodded. I handed over my card, signed the receipt, $847.32. My hands were shaking, but my mind felt clearer than it had in months. I walked out into the cold night air and sat in my car for a long moment, breathing. Not from anger, from relief. 10 minutes later, my phone started buzzing. "Where did you go? Everyone's asking about you. This is embarrassing." I didn't respond. I drove home, packed a bag, and went somewhere I knew I would be safe. For the first time in months, I didn't feel small. I felt finished. I didn't feel triumphant when I drove away from that restaurant. I didn't feel powerful or clever or proud. What I felt was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in after a storm finally passes, when your body realizes it can stop bracing for impact. My phone kept vibrating on the passenger seat as I drove. I didn't look at it. I already knew what it would say. Confusion first, then irritation, then accusations disguised as concern. I wasn't ready to hear any of it yet. When I got home, I moved through the apartment mechanically. I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet, folded clothes without caring whether they wrinkled, tossed in toiletries, my laptop, a pair of sneakers. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. My hands were steady in a way they hadn't been in months. I drove across town to my sister's place. She didn't ask questions when she opened the door and saw my face. She just stepped aside and let me in. That alone almost broke me. I slept on her couch that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the dinner in fragments. The laughter, the smirk, his voice telling me to leave. Sometime after midnight, I finally checked my phone. There were missed calls, 17 of them, voicemails stacked on top of one another. I listened to the last one first. His voice cracked halfway through. He sounded more upset about the optics than the damage. "Do you know how humiliating that was for me?" he said. "They think I did something horrible. They think we're breaking up." I deleted it without replying. The next morning, I woke up with a dull ache behind my eyes and a heaviness in my chest. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving space for doubt to creep in. Had I overreacted? Should I have said something instead of leaving? Should I have defended myself better? Then my sister brought me coffee and said quietly, "I've watched you get smaller around him for a long time." That was enough to ground me again. Around noon, a text came through from Amanda. "Thanks for dinner." That was generous, even though things got weird. Generous. Like I was some distant benefactor. Like I hadn't been sitting at that table being dismissed for hours. Mark showed up at my sister's place later that afternoon. I saw him through the window before he knocked. He stood there shifting his weight, checking his phone, running a hand through his hair. My sister asked if I wanted her to answer the door. I said no. He knocked twice, waited, knocked again. When no one came, he left. Watching him walk away felt strange, not painful, just final. On Monday, he emailed me. The subject line read, "Can we please talk about this like adults?" I read it once, then again more slowly. He said he was sorry I felt disrespected. He said he didn't realize I was that upset. He said his friends were just joking. He said leaving and paying for dinner was a manipulative power move that made him look bad. Not once did he say he was wrong. Not once did he acknowledge how he had treated me. I replied with one sentence, "I think we need space. I'll come get my things next week." That's when he escalated. He called my mother. My mom called me an hour later, worried, asking what happened. I gave her the short version. She was quiet for a long moment before saying something that lodged itself deep in my chest. "I've been biting my tongue for a while," she said, "but he's always acted like you were lucky to be with him." I sat on my sister's couch holding my phone, stunned. It's one thing to feel something in your bones. It's another to hear it confirmed by someone who loves you. By midweek, I started hearing how he was telling the story. According to him, I had gotten irrationally jealous of his friends, thrown a silent tantrum, embarrassed him in public, and abandoned him at a dinner meant to celebrate someone else. He was the victim. I was unstable, controlling, dramatic. Two mutual friends reached out to ask what really happened. I told them the truth. Both responded with some version of, "That actually makes sense." That response hurt more than the rumors, because it meant my experience wasn't invisible. It had just been ignored. Wednesday night, I went back to the apartment when I knew he'd be out. I packed slowly, carefully. I took my clothes, my books, my grandmother's necklace, the coffee maker I loved. I left behind the blazer he'd bought me, still hanging in the closet. I didn't want reminders of who I'd tried to be for him. As I carried my last box toward the door, the lock turned. He had come home early. He looked tired, unpolished, real in a way he hadn't been in months. "Wait," he said, "please." I stopped. I listened. He apologized. He said he'd been awful, that his friends were awful, that he got caught up trying to impress them. He said it wasn't just that night. He knew it had been months. I met his eyes. "You told me to leave." "I didn't mean it like that." "But you said it," I replied, "and I finally believed you." He cried, the messy kind, said he didn't want to lose me. "You already did," I said quietly. "You just didn't notice when it happened." I walked out without looking back. This time I didn't feel finished. I felt free. Freedom doesn't arrive gently. It arrives with aftershocks, and the days that followed were filled with them. Once I left the apartment for good, the narrative around me hardened. Mark didn't just lose control of the relationship, he lost control of the story. And that scared him more than losing me ever did. He started calling people, mutual friends, old coworkers, anyone who would listen. His version of events became sharper, more defensive. He said I had embarrassed him on purpose, that paying the bill was a calculated move meant to punish him, that I had been checked out for months and used that night as an excuse to walk away. According to him, I wasn't hurt. I was manipulative. What he didn't expect was how many people quietly disagreed. One by one, friends reached out to me. Not dramatically, not to take sides, just to say things like, "I didn't know how to say this before, but he never really treated you like an equal," or "You always seemed uncomfortable around that group." Each message felt like a small release of pressure, proof that I hadn't imagined everything. Then his family got involved. His mother called me, not to apologize, but to ask if I was really going to throw away 3 years over one dinner. I listened politely before answering. It wasn't one dinner. It was months of disrespect. That night just made it impossible to ignore. She sighed, frustrated. She told me Mark was devastated, that he hadn't meant to hurt me, that relationships required compromise. What she didn't say was that compromise should never require humiliation. I thanked her for calling and ended the conversation. I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear. Mark tried again, this time with apologies that sounded more polished. He sent messages acknowledging specific moments, the hand gesture at dinner, the jokes, the silence afterward. He said he understood now, that he'd started therapy, that he was willing to distance himself from that friend group if it meant saving us. For a moment, I almost believed him. But then I realized something important. Every apology came with urgency, with fear, with the unspoken panic of someone who had lost control of how they were perceived. None of it came from understanding my pain. It came from wanting the consequences to stop. I didn't argue with him. I didn't debate. I simply held my boundary. I'm not interested in fixing something that required me to disappear, I told him. I need distance. That distance changed me. Without constantly monitoring his moods, his tone, his reactions, I started to feel my own edges again. I laughed louder. I spoke without pre-editing myself. I slept better. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. The absence of tension revealed how much I had been carrying. Meanwhile, his life grew messier. That tight-knit friend group fractured. Drama turned inward. People chose sides. The same people who had laughed at that table began questioning each other. The circle that once made him feel elevated now made him anxious. He had built his confidence on their approval, and without it, he didn't know who he was. I watched all of this from a distance I didn't announce, but fully inhabited. The escalation wasn't explosive. It was cumulative. Every message unanswered. Every boundary held. Every version of myself I refused to abandon again. And slowly something inside me shifted. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was deciding. The darkest moment didn't happen when I left the restaurant. It didn't happen when I packed my things. It came later, when the noise finally stopped. A few weeks after moving out, the adrenaline wore off. The texts slowed. The calls stopped. Friends checked in less often, assuming I was doing better. On the surface, I was. I had my own space, my routines, my quiet. But at night, when there was nothing left to distract me, the weight settled in. I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the last year of my relationship like a slow-motion montage I couldn't turn off. Not just the dinner, everything before it. Every time I'd laughed off a comment that stung. Every time I'd stayed quiet because I didn't want to be difficult. Every time I'd told myself I was overthinking when my gut was screaming. What hurt most wasn't losing Mark. It was realizing how long I'd abandoned myself to keep him comfortable. There were moments I questioned everything. Maybe I should have spoken up earlier. Maybe if I'd set boundaries sooner, it wouldn't have ended like this. Maybe leaving so decisively made me cold. Maybe paying for dinner really did make me look manipulative. Those thoughts crept in quietly, dressed up as self-reflection, but they carried shame underneath. One night, I sat on the floor of my new apartment, back against the couch, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. I picked up the blazer he'd bought me months earlier, the one I'd left behind but later retrieved without thinking. It still smelled faintly like his cologne. My chest tightened. For the first time since leaving, I cried hard. Not elegantly, not silently. The kind of crying that leaves your throat raw and your body exhausted. I wasn't crying because I missed him. I was crying because I had loved someone who never truly saw me. That realization hollowed me out. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd tried to be for him. The agreeable girlfriend, the supportive partner, the quiet presence at loud tables. I thought about how easy it had become for him to tell me to leave, and how natural it had felt for me to obey. That wasn't love. That was conditioning. The loneliness hit hardest in small moments. Cooking for one, reaching for my phone with no one to text, sitting in silence without having to defend it. Freedom, I learned, can feel eerily similar to grief when you're not used to choosing yourself. I almost broke one night. I drafted a message to him. Just a few lines. Not accusatory, not desperate. Something safe. Something that would open the door without admitting weakness. I stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. I could already imagine his response. Apologetic. Careful. Just enough to pull me back into the cycle. That scared me. I deleted the message. Instead, I called my sister. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I just said, I don't feel strong tonight. She didn't rush to fix me. She stayed on the line. Let me breathe. Let me be quiet. Let me feel without rushing me past it. That night, something shifted again. Not upward, not hopeful, just honest. I accepted that I was grieving. Not just the relationship, but the version of myself who had believed love meant endurance. I accepted that healing wouldn't make me feel powerful right away. It would make me feel empty before it made me feel whole. The dark moment wasn't dramatic. It was still, heavy, necessary. Because you can't rebuild your sense of self until you stop pretending you're fine. And in that darkness, stripped of excuses and distractions, I finally saw the truth clearly. I hadn't lost my voice. I had given it away. And now I knew exactly what I needed to take back. The turning point didn't arrive with a dramatic apology or a grand realization. It came quietly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, when I least expected it. I was sitting in a small cafe near my new apartment, laptop open but untouched, when I heard my name. I looked up and saw Amanda standing a few feet away from me. No Bree, no entourage, just her, holding a coffee and looking uncertain, like she wasn't sure whether approaching me was a good idea. "Hey," she said softly, "do you mind if I sit for a second?" I considered saying no. I didn't owe her anything. But something in her posture, tentative and unguarded, made me nod. She sat down across from me and exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath. "I've been wanting to say this for a while," she began. "What happened that night? It wasn't okay." I didn't interrupt. I just watched her. She admitted that the comments at dinner had gone too far, that the group dynamic had become toxic, that people competed for attention and approval without realizing who they were stepping on in the process. She told me Mark had leaned into that energy instead of protecting me, and that several people in the group had noticed, even if they hadn't spoken up. "I should have said something," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't." Hearing that from someone who had been sitting at that table mattered more than I expected, not because I needed validation, but because it confirmed something important. I hadn't imagined the imbalance. I hadn't been too sensitive. I had been disrespected, repeatedly, in public, by the person who was supposed to be on my side. Before she left, Amanda added one more thing. For what it's worth, that friend group kind of fell apart after everything. Too much drama, too many lines crossed. I nodded, thanked her, and watched her walk away. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt release. Later that evening, Mark texted me again. Not apologetic this time. Defensive. He'd heard I'd spoken to Amanda. He wanted to clear things up. He wanted to explain his side. He wanted closure. That was when it clicked. He didn't want to understand me. He wanted control over the narrative. He wanted reassurance that he wasn't the villain in anyone else's story. I sat on my couch staring at my phone, feeling something solidify inside my chest. For months I'd been reacting, absorbing, enduring. Now I saw the pattern clearly. Every time I tried to explain my pain, it became a debate. Every boundary I set was treated like a challenge. I typed one message. "I'm not interested in revisiting this. I've said everything I need to say. Please stop contacting me unless it's something practical." My finger hovered for a moment, then I sent it. The silence that followed wasn't immediate, but it was different. He didn't push back. He didn't argue. He didn't send another essay disguised as self-reflection. For the first time since that night, he respected the boundary. Not because he understood it, but because he finally realized I meant it. That was the moment I chose myself without negotiation. I stopped waiting for him to admit he was wrong. I stopped hoping he'd suddenly see me clearly. I stopped measuring my healing by his responses. I rearranged my apartment that weekend, bought new bedding, took down the last photo of us that I'd kept out of habit, not attachment. I donated clothes I'd worn trying to be someone else. I started taking long walks without headphones, letting my thoughts settle instead of drowning them out. The turning point wasn't about closure from him. It was about authority over my own life. I realized I didn't need to leave loudly to leave completely. I didn't need revenge to reclaim dignity. I didn't need him to agree for my decision to be final. I had spent too long asking for space at tables where I was never meant to shrink. And now I was done asking. Once I stopped engaging, the fallout happened without me lifting a finger. I didn't announce anything. I didn't correct anyone publicly. I simply stepped back and let the truth collide with reality on its own. Mark struggled with that more than I expected. At first, he tried to act unbothered. He posted more than usual. Group dinners, inside jokes, tagged photos that looked carefully curated. From the outside, it might have seemed like he was thriving. But people talk when they think no one is listening. And what filtered back to me wasn't admiration. It was confusion. Friends started noticing the cracks, the way he retold the story differently depending on who he was talking to, the way his explanations never quite lined up, the way his frustration kept surfacing whenever my name came up, even when no one asked about me. The friend group he had worked so hard to impress began to fracture. Small arguments turned into sides. People who once laughed together stopped inviting each other out. That tight circle lost its shine when there was no one left to quietly absorb the discomfort. I hadn't been the problem. I had been the buffer. His family shifted next. His mother stopped calling, not because she suddenly understood my pain, but because the situation had become uncomfortable to defend. His sister reached out to me privately once, just a short message saying she hoped I was okay. No excuses, no justifications. That was enough. At work, things grew tense. Mark's confidence, once fueled by external validation, started to waver. He missed deadlines. He snapped at colleagues. The charm that had worked so well socially didn't hold up under pressure. The same performative energy that had elevated him in group settings now worked against him when there was no audience to impress. Meanwhile, my life became quieter in ways that felt intentional instead of empty. I settled into routines that belonged only to me. Morning coffee without rushing. Evenings without bracing for judgment. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected, people who didn't require me to explain myself or compete for space in a conversation. With them, my silence wasn't awkward. It was welcome. I didn't block Mark. I didn't need to. The distance did that work for me. When he reached out again, weeks later, it wasn't to apologize. It was to ask if we could at least be on good terms. The phrasing told me everything. He wanted absolution without accountability, peace without repair. I replied briefly, practically, and closed the door again. The most telling moment came unexpectedly. I ran into Bri one afternoon at a grocery store. She looked surprised to see me. Awkward. She hesitated, then said she hadn't realized how uncomfortable I'd been at those dinners. She said things had gotten out of hand. She said the group wasn't really hanging out anymore. Too much tension. Too many unspoken resentments. I nodded politely. I didn't correct her. I didn't explain myself. I didn't need her understanding to validate my experience. What struck me most wasn't that his world was shrinking. It was that mine wasn't. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt affirmed. I had left with dignity. I hadn't lashed out. I hadn't begged to be seen. And because of that, the consequences landed where they belonged, on the person who had mistaken my quiet for weakness. The fallout wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, unavoidable, and entirely earned. By the time Mark realized I wasn't coming back, not emotionally, not narratively, not quietly slipping into my old place, it was too late. I had already redefined what access to me looked like. And I had learned something I would never unlearn. When you stop shrinking, the people who benefited from your silence feel exposed. 2 months have passed since that night at the restaurant. My life doesn't look dramatic now. It looks smaller on the outside. A 1-bedroom apartment in a quieter part of town. Fewer social plans. Fewer voices competing for attention. But inside, everything feels steadier than it has in years. I adopted a dog from a local shelter, a 3-year-old mixed breed with uneven ears and too much trust in the world. I named him Rookie. He sleeps at the foot of my bed, follows me from room to room, and never once makes me feel like my silence is something to fix. Some evenings, we just sit together, no music, no phone, no pressure to perform. And for the first time, that quiet feels like peace instead of absence. Mark texted a few times in the first weeks. Apologies that sounded sincere on the surface. Questions about my family. One oddly practical message asking if I wanted my half of the couch. I kept my responses brief, neutral, kind, but closed. Eventually the messages stopped. Not because he suddenly understood, but because there was nothing left to pull on. Last week, I ran into Amanda at a coffee shop. She was with someone new, not Bri, not the old group. She apologized again, more directly this time. Said that night had been a wake-up call for a lot of people, that the friend group had mostly fallen apart. Too much drama, too many egos. I nodded, wished her well, and meant it. I didn't feel the need to explain myself or revisit the past. It was already where it belonged. My brother asked me recently if I regretted walking out that night. I thought about it for a long moment before answering. No, I said. The only thing I regret is staying quiet for so long before that. I should have spoken up months earlier, should have said, that hurt. Should have named the way I was being treated instead of absorbing it, but I don't beat myself up for that anymore. I did what I knew how to do at the time, and when I finally knew better, I did better. I'm glad I paid that bill, not as a power move, not as revenge, but because it was the last thing I did in that relationship on my own terms. I didn't beg, I didn't explode, I didn't shrink myself one more time to keep someone else comfortable. I chose when to leave, I chose how to leave, and I left knowing I had tried to be fair even when fairness wasn't returned. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's not about money or grand gestures or walking out dramatically. It's about something quieter and far more important. Silence can be strength, but only when it's chosen. The moment your silence is demanded, expected, or used to erase you, it stops being maturity and starts being self-betrayal. Love should never require you to disappear. Rookie just nudged my hand with his nose, leash hanging from his mouth. I think it's time for a walk, and for once, I'm not rushing to be anywhere else. I'm exactly where I need to be.